Our speaker for the opening lecture is Dr. Gilbert Meilaender. He had planned on being here with us in person, but due to some ailments, he is not in a position to travel, but he is joining us by Zoom tonight for this Virtue Ethics lecture. The Virtue Ethics Lecture Series Endowed Fund was established in 2023 by Dr. Richard and Mrs. Elizabeth Zimmerman in memory of their parents, Dr. Willis and Mrs. Janice Zimmerman, and Mr. Henry and Mrs. Anna Wellhausen. Because of their display of the virtues of generosity, kindness, and faithfulness. These virtues reflected the fruit of the Holy Spirit and impacted their family, friends, churches, neighbors, and community. We're deeply grateful to the Zimmerman family for establishing this endowed fund, which allows this lectureship to be an ongoing part of each year's conference. And there was a hiccup with this funding, and so thank you for praying that things would go smoothly and get sorted out, because this has gotten sorted out just this week. We finalized the sorting of the outness. As I mentioned, our speaker for tonight is Dr. Gilbert Meilaender. He taught at Valparaiso University from 1996 to 2014. Where he held the Phyllis and Richard Duesenberg Chair in Christian Ethics. Prior to teaching there, he had taught at the University of Virginia and at Oberlin College. He has published 13 books and numerous articles. He's a fellow of the Hastings Center, was a member of the President's Council on Bioethics from 2002 to 2009, and he was the 2009 recipient of the Center for Bioethics and Culture's Paul Ramsey Award for Excellence in Bioethics. And that's where I remember first meeting him. And he gave a talk in a room very much like this one that had one of these partitions. And on the other side of that partition was a rather raucous gathering. I don't know whether it was a birthday party or maybe it was like a 50th wedding anniversary, but I remember people going over several times and asking if they could hold it down just a little bit. But tonight, gratefully, he will not have to compete with any sort of gathering on the other side of the moving wall. As I mentioned, he was not able to be with us in person, but I am very grateful that he's able to join us by Zoom. So please welcome Dr. Meilaender.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I hope this is working. If it isn't, Brian or somebody will probably let me know. I'm sorry that I have to give the talk this way rather than in person. But as Matthew said, life is complicated. I guess a person who is my age and has gotten to this point in life and has never before had any back problems should be very grateful for that. But my gratitude sort of took a hit a couple weeks ago when I bent down to tie my shoe and my back just blew up on me. I still don't know exactly why, though I'm doing some therapy for it. It's doing some better, but it just didn't seem like the time to get on an airplane right now. So we're going to do it this way. I'm not very digitally up to date, so I'm just relying on the folks at the center to do this, and I hope this is working. I'm just sitting here in my study at home, and we'll hope that this works for you. You may also have, I think, a little outline. It's not really an outline of the talk, but it is an outline of some ways of comparing three different theories that I'm going to talk about. If you don't have it, don't worry about it. If you do have it, it may or may not help, but you can decide that for yourself. But at any rate, I'm pleased to be here to give this Zimmerman Virtue Ethics lecture, and we'll see what we can make of it together. I want to start with a little quotation, a little passage from C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, a book that I'm sure many of you have probably read. And this passage is one in which Lewis, sort of in the effortless way that seemed to come so natural to him and that the rest of us are often kind of jealous of, he made an illustration. It pointed to three considerations that are important for the moral life. And I'm just going to read you this passage to start. This is what Lewis wrote. Think of us, that is, of human beings, think of us first as a fleet of ships sailing in formation. The voyage will be a success only in the first place if the ships do not collide and get in one another's way. And secondly, if each ship is seaworthy and has her engines in good order. As a matter of fact, you cannot have either of these two things without the other. If the ships keep on having collisions, they will not remain seaworthy very long. On the other hand, if their steering gears are out of order, they will not be able to avoid collisions. But there is one thing we have not yet taken into account. We have not asked where the fleet is trying to get to. And however well the fleet sailed, its voyage would be a failure if it were meant to reach New York and actually arrived at Calcutta. Now, as I say, it's the sort of illustration that I'd be happy to sit down and think for a while and come up with, but Lewis, they just flow naturally from his pen. Now, I start with this because the analogy calls our attention to three important elements in moral reasoning. We could refer to them in various ways using various terminology. The first one, Lewis said, well, it's actually his third, but I'm going to put it first. It's important that the fleet of ships reach its destination. They have to know where they want to get. And so by analogy in moral reasoning, we use the language of the goal at which we're aiming, or the good that we're trying to realize, whatever we consider of value, what we're trying to get or accomplish. That's one important aspect of moral reasoning. And secondly, Lewis says that the ships cannot be constantly colliding and getting in each other's ways. They have to sail in the right way. And so by analogy in moral reasoning, we use the language of right and wrong, or duty and obligation, something like that. And then third, the ships have to be seaworthy, as Lewis says. That is, the engines have to be in good working order. And so by analogy in moral reasoning, we talk about virtues and vices, what makes a person's character good or bad, the sort of internal workings of our character. Now, I think that any serious ethical reflection is going to involve all three of these. If you really start to think about a moral problem, you're likely to find yourself at some point or other considering all three of these, considering what goals you're trying to achieve in your action, what duties you think obligate you in this case, and then third, what sort of person you'd be if you dealt with this moral problem in one way or another. So I think that when we think about moral problems, we're going to think about all of those, what it's good to accomplish, what seems right or wrong to do in these circumstances, and how people whose character we admire would act in similar circumstances. But at the same time, while we're almost surely going to think about all three of these and reflect on them, each one of us is likely in our moral reasoning to make one of these central. We won't necessarily ignore the others, but when our thinking is most centered and developed, it will probably be shaped primarily by one of these three approaches. And because any one of the three may be central, we can distinguish three different models for doing ethics. There's nothing original with me in coming up with these three models. Lots of other people have done it. But the three models would be distinguished these ways. First, we might make central in our thinking what is often called a consequentialist ethic. An ethic whose unifying motif is a focus on our goals, the results of our action, what we're trying to accomplish, the consequences we want to bring about. Or we might focus on and make central in our thinking what is often called a deontological ethic, where the unifying motif focuses on the language of duties and rights, what it is that we think we ought to do or sometimes ought not to do. And then third, what I will call an agent-centered ethic, an ethic of character, which, unlike the other two models, focuses less on, doesn't ignore our doing, but focuses less on our doing and on our being, on the sort of person, whether virtuous or vicious, that we are and are becoming. So any of us thinking will probably make one of those three models central at the heart of our moral reasoning. And I want to think with you about each of these three ways of ordering our ethical reflection, comparing and contrasting them on certain points. That's what that little outline, if you have it, really does. And considering also what place they might have in Christian moral thinking. In doing this, I'm going to be drawing on a book called The Responsible Self by H. Richard Niebuhr. It was published posthumously back in 1963, a year after Niebuhr's death, which makes the book, I guess, more than a half century old, maybe almost 60 years old. So it's been around a while, but my feeling is we should all be happy to write something that people would still be reading a half century after we had published it. That's a goal that many of us may not actually achieve. But I want to compare each of the three models on several different points that I am drawing in some ways from Niebuhr's discussion. So let's start with a consequentialist moral theory. Each of the three theories underlines and emphasizes a particular aspect of human action. For consequentialist theories, what's focused on, what they underline is that human action is goal-oriented. That is to say, we are in the world as people who have projects. We want to accomplish certain things that we regard as valuable, and that's surely a good thing. So we quite naturally focus on the possible results of our action. We ask ourselves, what's valuable? What results of our action would be good to achieve? What do we hope to accomplish? We're goal-oriented in that way. Each of the theories also has what I'll call a certain picture of the acting person, the moral agent. For the consequentialist sort of theory, H. Richard Niebuhr noted that we're really picturing the moral agent as a kind of craftsman, somebody who's a maker or a fashioner, who's producing something. Human beings are thought of as craftsmen trying to produce something that is worthwhile or valuable. And then the question that this craftsman asks himself or herself is, what's really valuable? What results would be good to achieve? Now, of course, in almost every case, the possible courses of action available to us are likely to produce several results, some good, some maybe not so good. And our task then is to try to, at least if we try to think of ourselves as craftsmen, our task is to try to find the course of action that seems likely to produce the greatest value overall, the best possible consequences. Another way to describe this approach, it's a way that I actually like to use. I don't know if it'll make sense to you, but a way to describe it is to say that for this first model, an ought to do follows from an ought to be. That is, for example, if it ought to be the case that no one suffer horribly while dying, then we ought to do whatever is necessary to relieve or minimize their suffering. Sometimes, perhaps, it might be that we even ought to do what would ordinarily seem wrong, as, for example, deliberately to end the life of someone who is suffering terribly. Now, we might hesitate to endorse that sort of moral reasoning. If you hesitate, it means that you may not be on the road to becoming a consequentialist, but we might have, even if we hesitate, we would still have to think through the issue here. One thing we'd have to do is take into account that there are a lot of consequences that will flow out of our action. We're not only relieving suffering, terrible suffering of someone, there are other things, other consequences we'd have to think about and factor into our reasoning. For instance, what will be the effect on other people who are intimately connected to this dying person if we do that? If this becomes a socially acceptable way to sort of think of treating the suffering dying, will it become harder for people who don't actually want to die to stay alive just by default, so to speak? Will they have to kind of defend themselves, stay alive? And we might want to think about what effect this would have on the medical profession. We might even wonder, if you have a kind of a metaphysical turn to your thinking, you might wonder whether there isn't something almost godlike in accepting responsibility for acting in this way. So we'd have to think about all those sorts of consequences. They might pull us in different directions, but still, a serious consequentialist is at least prepared to consider that in some cases a sufficiently good end can justify a means that might otherwise seem wrong. After all, this may make a kind of sense once we think of ourselves as craftsmen who are trying to fashion the best outcome possible given the circumstances in which we find ourselves. Consequentialist thinking has appealed to people for several reasons, and one of the reasons is that it seems to make moral reasoning a little bit more like a science. We've got all these possible consequences, and we have to sort of weigh and balance them in different ways. It seems a little more scientific, and it has in fact been, I think, especially appealing to people in the scientific and the technical communities, where we're quite naturally pragmatic and goal-oriented. We may also be drawn to this approach because it has what you might call a kind of progressive quality to it. It feels that way, focusing on future well-being. So it quite naturally appeals to us in our pragmatic, goal-oriented moods, or appeals to us when we're sort of eager to demystify moral problems and find technical solutions for them. There are also some reasons, different sorts of reasons, that consequentialist theories have sometimes appealed to Christians. After all, Christian understandings of the moral life often emphasize words like love and freedom. And at least at first sight, maybe not if you think about it long enough, but at least at first sight, being loving can sound a little bit like maximizing the well-being of as many people as possible. And love, as Christians sometimes talk about it, may seem to require a kind of active concern for others, a willingness to jump in and help them, the sort of active concern that maybe wouldn't let a little thing like a rule stand in the way of helping them. Christians also like the language of freedom. Jesus says the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And sometimes for some Christians, that's pretty much the beginning and the end of their moral theorizing. But we may think that we can really only serve the good of others if we free ourselves from the restrictions of binding rules. So consequentialists are likely to think that we're always free to re-examine and maybe obligated to re-examine our moral views in light of any new insight we get on what will benefit other people. Now, each of these three theoretical approaches has attractive features, but they also have problems and difficulties. Perhaps the most basic of these problems lies at the very heart of the consequentialist model. A consequentialist ethic asks us to try to look at life from the perspective of what the 19th century British philosopher Henry Sidgwick called the eye of the universe. It's a wonderful phrase, to look at life from the eye of the universe, if you think you can occupy the eye of the universe. Because if you think about it, that's a view from nowhere in particular. And because it's from nowhere in particular, it may not really suit human beings who are embodied and located, who occupy a particular place that has its own special responsibilities. To think of ourselves as the sort of moral agent that consequentialists have in mind may in fact exaggerate our responsibility for the state of the world. It can exhibit what the political theorist Michael Sandel once called a drive to mastery. So once we begin to think of this way, we can easily overestimate our ability to predict and control the results of our action. It may not turn out to be as scientific as we thought. So while it's true that we are craftsmen, that's true, that we're in the world as people who have projects, there is more than just this to say about human beings. So I turn now to the second model of moral reasoning, what we call deontology. The first model emphasized that human action is goal-oriented, and that's true, it is. That was the aspect of human action that it emphasized. But it's also true that we pursue those goals while living in community with others, others like us, people who have a dignity like ours, a dignity that should be respected. In that respect, our action has a communal aspect and has a kind of intersubjective quality to it. Now, if we ask ourselves for this model, what picture of the acting person is at work here in this model? H. Richard Niebuhr suggested that from this perspective, we think of ourselves less as craftsmen producing a product and more in what you might almost call political terms, as citizens living together in community with others like us under shared laws. And then the question that these moral agents now ask themselves is not what's the good or what's valuable, what that I should be trying to accomplish, but rather, from this perspective, the question is what's the rule? What's the law that governs our common life together? So we may not be able to plan out our life as completely as consequentialists sometimes suppose, but we can at least formulate the rules that govern our life together. And so this second kind of ethic is often called deontological, a word that it was simply coined from the Greek word deon, which refers to what is binding. Starting from this angle, we need to consider not so much simply the outcomes that we might hope to produce, but our actions themselves, whether they're right or wrong. So notice from this perspective, what we do is more central to the moral life than what we accomplish. And in deciding what kind of theorist you are, you have to think about that, whether you believe that what we do is more important than what we accomplish. So for this approach, there may be some actions that just ought not be done, even if they would achieve results that are, on the whole, desirable. And you might notice something significant here. For consequentialists, the moral world has a kind of unity. The right act simply is the act that will produce the greatest good. The right and the good are sort of held together in that way. But deontologists are a little more willing to let the moral world split apart a bit. The right and the good are not necessarily unified for deontologists. Those are two different kinds of moral judgments, what it would be good to accomplish and what it would be right or wrong to do. And sometimes maybe we just can't bring them into harmony. Maybe we can't unify them. Sometimes I like to put this in terms of what we could call simply positive and negative duties. Positive duties require us to bring whatever aid we can to others. Negative duties require us to refrain from treating others unjustly. And the deontologists claim, if you're a deontologist, you'll think that if it happens that these two sorts of duties, positive and negative, conflict, then negative duties take priority. We are surely responsible for trying to achieve what good we can in the world and for others, but only within certain moral limits, the limits that those negative duties point us to. So you could say that this second kind of theory agrees with what St. Paul says in Romans 3, that we ought not do evil, that good may come of it. Another way to put this is to say that our obligation to seek good outcomes is always shaped and governed by the obligation not to do wrong, even when doing so might seem to lead to desirable results. Both Jews and Christians have traditionally acknowledged, at least many of them have acknowledged, that the right is in this way prior to the good. So, for instance, the Talmud forbade handing over a hostage to be killed, even if refusing to do so would result in a greater number of people being killed, but you still shouldn't do it because it was unjust. And if we consider again the example of someone who is suffering greatly while dying, and we ask what our obligations towards such a person might be, from this perspective, we're less likely to think just or solely about the obligation to relieve that suffering, though we certainly wouldn't ignore that, but we think of a kind of solidarity in suffering, not standing over and above the one who suffers and deciding whether maybe the time has come for his life to end, but rather suffering with that other person, which of course is the meaning of compassion, to suffer with. Excuse me, standing with that other person in shared community. More generally, the concept of covenant that has been central in a lot of Jewish and Christian belief, that concept teaches us to think of ourselves as agents who are bound to others by claims of loyalty, claims of fiduciary loyalty that should be honored and upheld. So we're not just agents free to seek to produce the greatest good possible. We're trustees for others, bound by claims of covenant loyalty to them. It's rather like being a trustee of a will. If somebody makes you a trustee of their will, then your duty is to enact what is specified in the will, not to decide that on the whole it would be better to use the deceased resources in other sorts of ways. You're not free in that way. And here, for example, we might also think of medicine as a covenantal profession, with physicians committed first of all to loyalty to their patients. They're not just servants of the general good, they're servants of those patients. Now, no model of moral reasoning is perfect, and this model will have problems just as the consequentialist one did. And the chief problem for deontological theories is really an obvious one. You wouldn't have to think very long for it to occur to you. What happens when our duties seem to clash? We have these duties and they clash, and we don't know how to proceed. There are some obvious answers we might try to make, answers that theorists have made over the years. For instance, there's no reason that your duties have to be stated in very simple rules. We can build a variety of exception clauses into our rules to take account of some of the issues that arise. It may be that we could find some ways to rank the moral rules that govern our life, and that ranking would give us a kind of decision procedure when the duties seem to clash. Those things people have tried that. Or particularly if you have a kind of theological or metaphysical cast of mind, we might simply accept the fact that in a world disordered by sin, our ethical theories cannot be as neat and precise as we might like, though that won't necessarily help us in the moment when the duties seem to clash. Those are all reasonable answers, and they may help some, though of course when the duties seem to clash are the times when people are most likely to be drawn toward that first theory, consequentialism. And then third and finally, what I'm calling an ethic of character or an agent-centered ethic. When Matthew emailed me to see whether I could consider speaking at this conference, and probably if I'd known what was going to happen, I probably should have said no, but I didn't. When he emailed me, the invitation in his email was to give what he called the Virtue Ethics Lecture. By now, I suspect he may be wondering how carefully I read that email. But I come at last to something that will seem to respond to it, to what I will call an ethic of character. Lewis comment that for ships to be seaworthy, their internal workings, their engines have to be in good working order. You may also have noticed that I titled this lecture, The Virtues and Vices of an Ethic of Virtue. And I did that partly for a reason that any of you who have been asked to give a talk may recognize. When Brian just emailed me to ask for a title, and even more, not just a title, but he even wanted an abstract of the talk, I had not yet gotten around to the point of preparing the talk, and it's always a little hard to write an abstract for a talk that doesn't yet exist. But I did have an idea of the sort of thing I wanted to do, and so I gave him this title, and I think there is something to it. There is, I believe, a lot to be said for what has been called virtue ethics, especially for the revival of virtue ethics, a revival of sorts in, I'd say, the last half of the 20th century. But it's not a perfect theory necessarily. And so I actually think, and I'll come back around to this, that I think that it may be best to think of it in conjunction with either a consequentialist or a deontological approach. There's no doubt in my mind, by the way, that H. Richard Niebuhr, on whose categories I've been relying, would have preferred this third type of theory, even if he probably wouldn't have described it in quite the way that I've been doing. Now, however different the consequentialist and deontological theories are from each other, they are alike in one way. Each focuses on a judgment about actions, about what we ought to do, what actions we ought to do or ought not to do. This third approach is different. It doesn't ignore that, but it focuses less on our doing than on our being. It emphasizes neither the good nor the right, but character, our virtues and our vices. And so we often call it, as I did, an agent-centered rather than an act-centered ethic. Now, if we think about this theory, and we ask sort of what aspect of action do we emphasize when we think in this third way? For the first way of thinking, it was our action is goal-oriented. For the second is it's intersubjective, that it takes place within a community of others like us. For this third way, we think of ourselves as, so to speak, and this is going to be very Niebuhrian language here. We think of ourselves as embedded in a world that bears down upon us in many different ways. Our actions are shaped in countless ways that the world bears down upon us. And that in turn then affects the image we have of human beings, of how to describe the acting person. In a world that bears down upon us in countless ways, we will think of human beings less as craftsmen. You're not likely to be in charge enough to be a craftsman in such a world, nor even as citizens, but rather, to use Niebuhr's terms, as responders or answerers. We're constantly responding to and being shaped by events that go on around us. And our actions both express our character, who we are right now, and they shape our character, who we will become. And then the question we have to ask ourselves, the question the moral agent has to ask himself or herself on this third view, is not so much the craftsman's question, what's valuable, what would I like to produce here, nor the deontologist's question, what's the law, but rather the question here is, what is a fitting or appropriate response to whatever's going on around us? Niebuhr suggested, and I think it's a nice illustration of what we mean here. He suggested that we think about what we mean when we say that someone is a good car driver. Probably many of you have at some point or another had to teach someone how to drive a car. One of the most terrifying things you can do in life, actually. I've done it several times. But if you think about it, the good driver is making countless decisions, responding in every moment to what's going on around him. And so you can't be a good driver just by following the rules of the road that are set down in the driver's manual. You can't just be a good deontological driver in that sense, following the rules. Because after all, sometimes adhering to those rules might cause real harm. So it's not sufficient. Nor can you simply drive in the direction of your destination, your goal, like a good consequentialist driver, paying no attention to what lies ahead of you on the road. I mean, there may be a little girl ahead of you on the road, and you shouldn't just keep heading toward your goal. So the idea, whether with respect to driving or simply to living life generally, the idea is to become the sort of person who can respond appropriately in a variety of circumstances, a person who has the developed capacity to act with excellence. Now that can seem kind of vague. I think it is kind of vague in some ways, and yet I bet if you think about it, almost all of us know at least a few people who we think seem to have that capacity, the capacity to respond appropriately in all sorts of circumstances, to act with excellence in that way. And this is why we often think of the virtues as a little like habits. It's not a perfect illustration of what a virtue is, but it gets toward it. If I'm standing on the pitcher's mound and I throw a perfect pitch low and outside at the knees, if I do that just once, not really a big deal. It may just be an accident. But if through training and work I become able to throw that pitch regularly, habitually, it's now a capacity that, at least to some extent, I possess, that characterizes me. And acquiring virtues is a little like that. It means becoming a person of a certain sort, a person with a certain kind of character who can be relied upon, usually at least, to act in certain kinds of ways. And then that character, who we are, affects what we see when we look around. So sound moral judgment depends on more than just knowing what to accomplish or sort of what our duties are. It depends also on accumulated experience, developed sensitivities, wise exemplars, a good community that shapes us, and perhaps divine guidance. The moral life is about becoming the sort of person who really has the capacity for moral discernment. David H. Smith, who taught for many years at Indiana University and died just a year or so ago, David once used a little illustration an illustration of sensitive discernment, and I've often quoted it because I just think it's so good. Because it's really about how to treat virtuously those who are nearing the end of life. This is what he wrote. A couple invite friends to dinner. Food and drink are pleasant, the conversation bubbles. The good host is hospitable and courteous to his guest, no matter what the shifts in mood. But there comes a time when the party winds down, a time to acknowledge that the evening is over. At that point, not easily determined by clock, conversation, or basal metabolism, the good host does not press his guest to stay, but lets him go. Indeed, he may have to signal that it is acceptable to leave. The good host will never be sure of his timing and will never kick out his guest. His jurisdiction over the guest is limited to taking care and permitting departure. I just think I wish I'd written it. It's that good. So this third model of moral reasoning has always played a significant role in Christian thought. Attention to the nature of virtue and vice has a very long history in Roman Catholic moral theology, where the influence of Aristotle's ethic of character has been important, at least until quite recently when the actual language of virtue began to be re-emphasized among Protestants. That language wasn't used quite so much, but Protestants often drew attention to the importance of character through language about motive or holiness or inner spirit. Judaism has often used the language of holiness also. And one of the strengths of this third model is that in ways that I think go well beyond either of the first two models, it makes place in ethics for the role of religious communities and for disciplines such as prayer, confession, service, and praise. Those disciplines all shape us. They shape the self, they expand our moral vision, they constantly reorient us in relation to God, so that the moral life becomes, to use fairly common Christian language, a life that is lived in the Spirit. Now, despite these, what I think are attractive features of an ethic of character, my own view, as I said before, is that as an ethical theory, it cannot really stand alone. Taken by itself, it's unlikely to be sufficient, and I think it's better thought of as supplementing one of the first two approaches to moral reasoning, though by my lights, supplementing the deontological approach rather than the consequentialist. At any rate, taken by itself, if you take it all by itself, an ethic of character can easily lead in the direction of moral relativism. After all, our character is formed not just in one overarching community, but at least as much in many smaller sub-communities. So we're formed in different communities. Different people have been shaped in quite different ways and may therefore respond to what goes on around them in equally different ways. And that explains, at least to some extent, why an ethic of virtue taken by itself may have difficulty dealing with public questions or helping us to find common ground in public life when we're trying to overcome those various ways in which we were shaped. And there may also be an even deeper problem. Not everybody would agree with about this, but I think there may be an even deeper problem embedded in an agent-centered ethic. And the problem is precisely that it is agent-centered. Alasdair MacIntyre, who was one of the people actually most responsible for reclaiming the language of virtue and vice in recent decades, once wrote that no account of morality could possibly be adequate if it did not reckon with the truth that adhering to what is right might require my death at any moment. And if that's true, you might say, my flourishing cannot be at the very heart of morality. And yet, when in the late 20th century there came to be renewed attention to an ethic of virtue, it was often characterized as focusing on human flourishing. That's a way of thinking that has its roots in Aristotle, who might be called the first virtue theorist. The idea of that is a sort of a simple one. Cultivating the virtues enables us to shape ourselves, to become more fully what human beings are meant to be, which is all true, and in that sense, to flourish. Nevertheless, while it is true that if we are virtuous, we will in countless ways attend to the good of others, there remains something just, to my mind, I'm not saying you have to agree, but there remains something inevitably a little self-referential about making cultivation of my character rather than commitment to what I owe to others central to the moral life. That said, there are, though, considerable strengths in an ethic that focuses more on being than on doing. That I would not wish to deny. Think again of David Smith's picture of the good host. That good host has a kind of humility that senses our limits and honors human frailty. To be sure, you couldn't make a public policy or a law out of that description of the good host. But if consequentialism appeals to those who would like to make ethics a science, and deontology, though less a science in its focus on duties, pays less attention to the agent who has those duties, in an agent-centered focus on virtue, we see what it might mean to say that without people whose character has been well formed by the virtues, human life will be immeasurably poor. Thank you very much.